I used to define my nothingness with abandonment. I used to define my nothingness with my worthiness. Less is more. The power of nothing. The fear of nothing, the fear of the nothingness, the fear of the unknown, what you define the unknown as. We're always going into the aspects of the unknown is whatever you project into that space. Remember Star Wars, anything that tells, like, remember Yoda, what's in that cave, whatever you take in there with you. This is the power of nothingness and what we give definitions to energetically, how we energetically define things in our space in order to maintain our perspective. Peace. In order to maintain our perspective, in order to maintain how we move, in order to maintain how we sustain, it's all in the aspects of that old perception of ourselves, staying in this old perception. Now that you come to a point with yourself where you realize that less is actually more. Just saying that over and over and over again to myself earlier on. Still saying it to this moment in time, but saying less is more. But due to how we define our nothingness, how we define our nothingness, that void, that's what we create, i.e. from that void. Instead of being, there's that difference between sitting in the nothingness and sitting at the nothingness. See, a lot of times I used to sit at the nothingness. That means I would sit at this moment where it was an emotional breakdown or it was a chance for me to become present, and I would analyze what nothing was to me. So then everything that came up in my space, boom, here's my universe, what come up to me would be definitions of what nothing looks like. It's kind of like whenever someone talks about, you see a homeless person on one side, and then you're saying, at least I have, you're always going to say, at least I have more than them. But that guilt for yourself of you trying to maintain the space is why you'll react to, ooh, that person is homeless. Let me go get them something to eat. But in that same instance, you'll sit there and say, instead of giving them what they need or what they think that they need, you're going to try to give them what you would want if you were in that position. A lot of times when we're going to that aspect of, and this is based on the maintaining our perspective of what we believe to be inside of our space, what it is to be the good person. This is why you'll look at somebody sometimes you'll look at somebody that's giving out money to the homeless and they've recorded it. You shouldn't record those moments and things of that nature, but you're not really looking at it as, I need video documentation to write this off on my taxes. So you're not understanding the process. Everything that you do has an intention. Just because what I do sets the tone for how I embrace my nothingness, it can be a trigger to embracing aspects of your nothingness. That's when we look at certain things. You shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't have this. You shouldn't put attention towards that. Then how else would it be seen? How else could it be used? How else could it be manipulated if it's not constantly inside of your face? The definition, when we think about nothingness, not having anything, you're always given what it would be seen as the negative connotation to your higher self. Because simply you waking up means you have something to do. But if I see it from nothing, then everything that I see is an obstacle of that nothing. I have nothing in my refrigerator. Okay. So now I have a reason to be. I have a reason to go here. I have a reason to do this. I got a reason to do something. I have a stimulation or a stipulation on the table to the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. But if I stay within that mentality with myself, then I'm always going to create these stipulations in order to do something. The reason that I went and got this, the reason that I'm going to go do this, the reason that I said this, the reason that I acted this way, is always going to have that external point. Because I'm avoiding the nothingness. I'm avoiding the nothingness. I'm avoiding this deep aspect to myself. I'm avoiding going through the levels because in my nothingness is not peace. In my void, inside of my deepest self, I'm not at peace. And I'm not at peace because at that point where I lost that idea of what peace was, or the ability to create in a peaceful state or come to a state of resolve, that was taken from me. And until I'm get this back in full, I'm going to continuously speak that this shit was taken from me. My chance was taken from me to do what I could have done, what I've always done. That's how we get stuck in that aspect. The moment that you start assessing things, it's never from, this is when you start looking at yourself, thinking about, you start assessing yourself from the surface point. Well, if you keep avoiding the nothing, what have you defined? Not coming to that point of the nothingness. In the nothingness, there is all. In the all, there is nothing. That's what's inside of that space. So if I can sit in the nothingness and just sit there in the nothingness, what would I see? What would I see? What would come up? What would pop off? What pops off in your side of your nothingness? Whenever you're sitting inside that space, remember we've broken down the power of the meditation is not to clear your mind, but to allow the noise to come in. How does that noise make you feel? That's inside of your nothingness. That's leading you to your nothingness. Everything leads you back to yourself. Anything that doesn't lead you back to yourself would be the aspect of you not being able to sit there with me, not being able to sit there with myself for periods at a time. If I can't sit there for 15 minutes without something coming up, it's not about me avoiding what didn't come up. It's about me sitting there like, why can't I sit here for 15 minutes? Why can't I assess myself through this 15 minutes at a time? What is so hard about me giving myself 15 minutes? I'm saying that I'm deserving. That's something simple. Because I put a definition on what nothing was. That definition became the attitude of what struggle was. So now that I'm looking at the aspects of struggle, there's a higher degree to struggle. Because every time you go to the gym, every time you go for a walk, every time you do a recipe, every time that you watch a TV show, you're struggling. You struggle to stay awake, to watch TV. You struggle. So there's the higher and the lower degrees of struggle. You can struggle and sit on the couch and just sit there and watch TV and struggle to reach for something. But at the same time, in that same space, there's somebody struggling to take themselves to their next level in their weights. There's somebody struggling to take themselves to the next level in school. So the result, the ultimate result, is based on what you view as struggle. I talked about it yesterday in the Tik Tok video when we talked about the hustle mentality. I'll lose it and get it right back. But in between that moment, you never take the moment to assess, why do I keep losing this? Why do I keep losing this? So once I understand why I keep losing or why I cannot gain, is usually based on those points of the points of that convergence, where that energy comes up at. Whenever you're inside of that space, where does that energy come up at? When you're inside of that space, how do you deal with this energy, this flux of energy? because that's what you're aligned to. Think about when your aspects, your mental state, and what you're aligned to. Remember, on TikTok, we talked about ideas being the identities of self, the ideal of how you view yourself, how you see yourself, the perception of yourself. So the only way to generate a new idea is to take on a new perspective. And then the events inside of our spaces are the patterns and the habits. So every event based on my idea of myself becomes the events that I now am privy to. And then when I look at the aspects of the people, now I'm looking at behaviors and reactions. These behaviors and these reactions are based on my patterns and my habits, based on the ideal of myself. So I have to take that full ownership. You got to take that full ownership. That I that you used in the state of, the I that you use in the state to get to a certain point, and now you're sitting in that point now where you're like, this I doesn't work anymore. That means I cannot see. This is usually whenever you hear the certain tones of your body when you say, I can't see this, I never saw it that way, never thought about that. That's that conversation you having with yourself. That's you coming to that state of resolve with yourself. That's you coming to that state of realization with yourself. That's that awareness. The longer that we stay inside it, the longer that you start to get comfortable sitting inside that space for yourself, that becomes that 15 minutes. That becomes that 30 minutes. That becomes that 45 minutes. Yo, look at it like this. Think about old people. Think about when you were young, and then like when you were young, you needed a lot of, I need a lot of noise. I need the noise. I need to feel it. But when you get old, when you get to a certain age and you looking outside, you walking down the street and you like looking down and you looking at like the young kids running up and down on dirt bikes or whatever, making a lot of noise. And you're like, that shit make my hair. I need to go in the house. Or you say still like, I'm done peopling. It's because as you start to sit with yourself, you start to realize less is more. See, sitting in that state of saying less is more means that I can sit presently in that space and realize I always talk about, you're always in the right position. From this position, either you see opportunities or you see obstacles. Opportunities are, when we always talk about opportunity, it's the resource so to expand, grow, evolve, learn, teach, as opposed to going to the obstacle. The obstacle is that emotional catalyst of, oh shit, I got to do this. I got to put something here. The obstacle becomes that emotional debt. It feeds into the emotional debt. I remember coming from the nothingness of what I view nothing as was my worth. So so naturally, where I had opportunities to like actually embrace, like, nigga, I'm okay, cool. Where I had that nigga moment to be like, okay, let me breathe. I don't know how to breathe. I don't know how to this. I've been running my whole life. Been running like a track star my whole life. Let me sit down. Let me sit down. Oh shit, everything's about to come up. All right, cool. That means the longer that I sit inside of that space, the more stuff's going to start coming up. Everything that I've done, I'm going to feel everything. I go back and do that moment. I'm feeling everything that I'm feeling inside of that moment. God damn, I did this back in 2006. I did this back in 2012. I did this in 2008. And then you start looking at the negatives. But then, as this is the key, as I'm looking at those negatives, now I got to start focusing myself to the positives. Why did I do that instead of what I said I was going to do? I said I was going to go to school. Again, I said I was going to go finish this. Why didn't I do it? And it's usually always for the same reason that I did it the first time. Like the simple reason I've told people this, or I've said this before, the reason I went to go to school, because I really the only reason I went to school for psychology was to understand my head, to understand what was going on inside of my mind, to really understand what was wrong with me. For what my definition was of there was something wrong with me. to gather the information to see what the fuck was wrong with me. So naturally, that has to continue to live. So now everything that I do that's based on something new has been defined by that point. So every time that I learn something, that's how I'm learning it. It's based on finding something out about myself. So now everything that led up to that, now I open up that gate. I open up this gateway to all of these thoughts. All of these, whether they're intrusive, other thoughts, my thoughts, previous perceptions, ideals, I get locked within those. Well, nigga, I'm this age and I can't learn anything else because I'm compressing age, my nothingness from how I learned and applied mechanics to my space, but I never can get back to that moment to when I was between ages 1 and 4, where all I watched was commercials. Between 1 and 4, all I watched was commercials. And the only reason you think about a commercial being 30 seconds to maybe a minute, not being that long, think about all of the information that's being streamed within 30 seconds, within that minute. So I had to go back to that point as an example because that's how I define the sequences or learned how to absorb sequences based on the nothing. That's how I learned it. That's how, so damn, what else did I learn back? What else have I learned? What other pattern did I quickly learn to evolve myself with that I've used to create my space, that I've used to create my perspective? Everything from going back, I've told the story about the aspects of being stuck at the age of being 13 because of the first argument with my mother. And I won that argument because I looked at how my pops would interact with my mother. So I thought, yo, that's the way I'm supposed to be interacting with everything in the feminine aspect when it comes to emotion. So that naturally, first, that's how you learn how to react to your own emotions. That's how you learn how to react to your own emotion. When we think about when you're given this ideal, this learned behavior of the male and the female perspective and how it's maintained or how it's visualized, it's really based on the wounded perception, the learned behaviors, the experiences that created that perspective. That's why it always has to be streamed inside front of your face, that you have to keep consuming the elements of that perspective. This is what this means. This is what this is. So now you get stuck in that side of that perspective. But what if you came back to the nothing point with yourself? Then you start looking at the aspect of, damn, I had this expectation for my life, this expectation for my life, this expectation for my life. And I had this sense, I thought that this expectation led to this title. And as long as I have this title, I can hold these expectations. But I have to keep, just like you think about renewing you got to keep renewing the certification to keep that title and that expectation going. So the way that you went into that space to create that title or gain this identity, it must be maintained. At all costs, this mentality must be maintained to keep you acting as to avoid your nothingness. A lot of times you're thinking about, so everything is based on that less is more. So now you got to think about, we've been thinking about as more as less. So you're think about positions that you've been in. So when you're looking at yourself inside of that space and you're like, damn, my life has been you have to think about things of that nature, how, like, using the way that the aspect of nothing and how I connected it to my worthiness, my self-worth. And how I defined my self-worth was by being able to prove that I am more. Not understanding that I clearly was enough, or I wouldn't be inside of that space, in that position. But you see that everything before that, in between that point, stopped me from going back into that nothing. Because I feared nothing. I had that fear of that nothingness. That void of that fear of that nothingness. Having nothing. Because how I define having nothing. The struggles of the struggles of a black youth in America. But half of the time when you were sitting back in that space, whether you were flipping on mattresses, or you were running around pretending y'all were cops or whatever you were doing, you really didn't even think about it while you was inside of your space. We didn't have Nintendo until like 1996, 1997, 98. Yes. Yes. When you keep saying something as simple that we thought was simple as I know my worth and it's based on my works, but I'm just looking at it from an external sense, that means I have to keep doing the external. I got to keep the external living because my definition of worth is based on not having anything. So now who am I proving it to? Whatever is inside of my space, okay. But what am I proving to myself? How am I setting that tone for myself? Do I really when's the last time that I sat down with Carlos in the dark, in those moments when he thought he wasn't worthy, when he thought he wasn't worthy, when he thought he wasn't valued, or he wasn't when am I going to sit with those points? Because that's the person that I'm still trying to prove. That's the person that that's the person that's giving me my perspective. That's the one that's drawing those pictures inside of my mind, drawing all the pictures inside of my mind, writing all the poems, writing all the short stories, writing all the suggestions that fill inside of my subconscious. He's the one fulfilling all of that. I'm denying him any value. I'm denying his worth. So now I got to look inside of my space. So when I'm triggered in that space, it's really letting me know that I'm denying myself the lesson of my own worth. It's denying myself to really learn the lesson of where I learned value. It's I'm denying myself that. I'm denying myself that moment. Because I've gotten used to denying myself the moment has become second nature. As opposed to me like, you know what, let me sit down and truly do nothing today. Let me truly sit down and enjoy and give thanks and gratitude to the day. See, there's a difference between you going through these aspects of gratitude and understanding that when you give gratitude, you receive it. Gratitude is from the nothingness. Gratitude is from the nothingness. To be able to give gratitude because you did it simply just being. When you simply wake the fuck up, I'm in gratitude for the breaths I'm able to take, the energy I'm able to dispel, and the things I'm taking in. I'm in gratitude for everything that I'm learning. See, now if I approach it based on remember we talked about the I got to. If I approach it based on I got to do this to get this, then that becomes I'm unconsciously activating the law of even exchange. That means whatever I'm about to put out energetically is what I'm going to receive physically. It's kind of like when you think about the aspects of everything has its price. You can know the price of everything, but if I don't understand the internal value, I don't really know what I'm giving up. See, that's the thing when it comes to you, when you don't understand your worth. You don't understand what you're giving up. A lot of the times I was getting stuck in those spaces because I didn't really understand of what I was really like, oh my God. So at the end of it, So every time that I'm sitting inside of that space, whenever it's the presence, and this is when this is why I always talk about emotional intelligence. When that emotion comes up to where it start feeling, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror. I'm looking at myself when I leave. I'm looking at myself doing everything, but I'm looking at it through the perspective of the lack. Remember, we talked about it yesterday, the aspect of the events of lack versus the ownership of the assessment, that asset. I wasn't looking at myself as an asset. And then I looked at how I was. Then when you really start looking at how, like, yeah, I don't eat like an asset. I don't sleep like an asset. I don't do these things as an asset. I'm kind of doing these things as a liability to myself. That's why I always need this state for myself, especially for me, in that aspect of my shadows, is understanding like, damn, a lot of my shit was due to the abandonment, the separation, and the guilt. So a lot of the things that I did was based on that premise. So now I have this jaded sense of what my value system is. My buying power, my curve. So I'm always looking at, well, I have this and I have this. So as long as I have these two things, I'm pretty much good. But what happens can I imagine myself without them? That becomes your key. Can you imagine yourself without that? What would it look like without that? Whatever comes up is that's the result of what you face. So now you start to see how you created those definitions. We talked about it yesterday, understanding how we create these definitions. My energetic definition of money was based on proving, abandonment, and regret, neglect. So the only times where I'm looking at the spaces where I was at, something as simple as my job being at a restaurant, usually I have to depend on people that neglecting themselves to learn how to cook, to want to be able to cook, or whatever ceremony they're trying to do inside of that space. So I'm dependent upon that to happen so I can be like, yeah, we got busy because of this. Yeah. But then, because that's still present, I need that to play out in some way, shape, or form inside of my space. So if that's not happening out there, it has to happen here. It has to happen here. That must continue to play out. That's my definition to money. That's my definition of time. That's my definition. So based on my definition, I now have my expectations. Based on those expectations, I now have my title. Now I have the level of titles that I'm going to try to achieve. All because I'm scared of nothing. I'm scared to go into my nothingness. I fear nothing. I fear sitting in the nothingness. I fear sitting in that space with me. I fear it. Everything that I put in there was based upon fear. So that's when you start to unload, when you start going into these voids, into your shadows. That's why that shit gets so deep. Because now you're releasing it. You're releasing these old definitions. You're releasing what defined you. See, this is when you're releasing what defined you. You're releasing what made you. You're releasing it. You're releasing what made you. So you can now become the less. So you can now become the nothing. Until you release what made you, you can't sit in the nothing and create. You can't openly create whatever you're inside of your space. Something as simple as me, if you came in, we always go into this. If you told me 8.5 years ago that I would be sitting in front of a camera, the image that would come to my mind on sitting in front of a camera will be strictly on appearance. What I look like, what am I wearing, what am I doing, all of these things would come up. But if you were to show me this video to myself 8 years ago, like this nigga sitting in front of the camera, and all he got on is, he ain't got nothing, like he has nothing. That nigga is like happy as fuck. But I couldn't see that. I wouldn't be able to see myself as being happy. Because I had a definition of what happiness was. Until we understand those definitions, you are not going to be able to shift. You're only going to just keep taking things in. We talk about all the time the romanticism. You don't keep romanticizing of the thought. Let me romanticize my life as what it should be. Let me vision my life with the house. But meanwhile, you're not understanding the energetic undertones of what a house mean to you. The only energetic undertone is like, you don't want a house that was like your parents' house. That's why when that's why you looking like, I just don't want a house like my parents' house. Or you looking at the size of your parents' house. And you're looking at that based on worth. Like, they had that big ass house, but you never looked at the reason that they had the big ass house was what they had to fill the house with. They had 5 or 6 kids. They needed all that space. But you're trying to go acquire that same space for what? You're going to have to fill it up the same way. So now instead of you having kids, now you got dogs and cats and all types of shit in your house. You got TVs and all this other type of shit in your house. Shit that has no true worth or has no true value or depreciates just like your energy does whenever you keep it to, just like your energy is depreciating. Because you need that charge, you need that stimulation. But I desire you to be the fucking best. I desire you to be the best. I desire you to shift into that truth with yourself. That's why this healing is destructive. Understanding that this healing is destructive, you are deserving, but you are not entitled. And understanding that this level of honesty. So then ever since then, you sitting there like, that definition stays in your mind of, if I have to get rid of something, it ain't about selling something. If I got to sell something, it's attached to my worth. There's something that simple. You like, God damn, man, we kept moving. As an example, like you say, we had to keep moving, but you're not looking at the events in between that move. Like we had to move. We only moved twice. But every time that we moved, there was a reason that we had to move. What we were shown was, well, this happened and this happened. But in reality, I'm looking like I'm older, so I'm seeing, I'm like, the reason that we moved was because my mom didn't have financial literacy, financial intelligence. And since my pops didn't have emotional intelligence, he could not sit as a teacher, because he would always say that, I didn't say things, I don't teach. Because he didn't have the emotional intelligence to teach my mother financial intelligence. And my moms didn't have the emotional intelligence to be open to learn something new. So that's what I learned how to do. So everything that I did was based on, I have this, and this. You got this, and this. This how we gonna come together. Da 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 da. It expected to work. There was no plan. It was a pattern. But yeah, as you start shifting through these layers, you start like really sitting there with yourself and realizing yourself. That's when you embrace the change. From the nothingness, you can create everything. What you're gonna create from your nothingness, you must first make it. You must come to resolve with what's inside of your void. Come to resolve what's inside of that space. And that's the healing process. That's why it's so destructive. That's why you're deserving, but you're not entitled. That's why that level of honesty is going to remove the scales of what you thought you were, the romanticism of entitlement and expectation. It's time for you to be the fucking best. Y'all know everything from the readings, consultations, hitting that, just starting that dialogue to see where you at, to see where you need to go, see how Papa Lucifer can assist, give you some guidance. Hit me up in the inbox. As always, give thanks. Give gratitude. Give gratitude to yourself first so you can give gratitude to others. Give thanks to yourself so you can give thanks to others. Allow yourself to go into that shadow. I love you. We love us. Ashe.